Hey car fans, we're back on this Porsche 911 3.2 liter engine. Last time we had the cams installed, everything is assembled, working well, spinning nicely. Today I want to finish the valve train and do the cam timing and all the rocker setup and the valve lash and all the good stuff. Make this thing run well. I have started a few things here in my ultrasonic cleaner, just getting things ready for install. And I do have a box of parts. Oh, this is a new pivot shaft for the transmission. That's for the G50. We have the side cover gaskets or cam covered gaskets. I think this is a rear main seal. We'll replace that. These are silicone valve cover gaskets. I've never tried these, but we'll hopefully get those on today. And this is what I need now. This is the O-ring for the cam, or at least the cam thrust block. And then I've got new insulators for the intake. We've got new chain ramps, all sorts of goodies. Hood strut, deck lid strut. All the gaskets that we need to kind of keep this engine from leaking. Oh, these are the rocker shaft O-rings. These have just been sitting on here to keep the engine clean or keep things from falling into it. We'll get these put in the ultrasonic cleaner too. So here are the original parts that I've bagged for the cylinders, 4 through 6. The next thing to put in is this thrust block or thrust spacer. And so it goes right there. I like to put it in without the O-ring and just make sure that it's concentric with the bolt holes. There is some tolerance here because when the heads were machined, everything gets a little bit closer. But there's plenty of room for this to fit the bolt pattern and also create a seal. Even with the bolts in there, there's still plenty of room for it to kind of wiggle up and down. So the O-ring is going to also keep it centered, and then we'll bolt it down. This gasket remover works pretty well. I'm using like the Permatex equivalent of a Loctite 574. It's an anaerobic sealant. And then just silicone rubber grease on the rubber. I'm going to measure the thickness of the old gasket and compare it to the new because it does affect the position of the cam. So this guy, let me find a good section. It's about 20 thousandths of an inch or 1/2 millimeter. The new one also measures 0.48, so roughly the same. Yeah, 0.49. So that means that the cam is going to be roughly in the same position. And then we'll go through and make sure that the sprocket is aligned to the intermediate shaft sprocket. we'll use these bolts to kind of draw it in to position, because that gasket is pretty big. Luckily, these bolts are long enough. See, it's just inching its way in. So you just want to monitor the O-ring as it ducks inside that little bore there. And you can feel the tension on the nuts, the bolts. So it's going in nice and flat. All right. So now that it's seated, I'm going to take them out one at a time. I'm just going to put a little bit of blue Loctite on here. You know, this would be catastrophic if these came loose. Okay, just 10 Newton meters on these guys. Okay, and then these are the parts that I took off of this side. So I'm going to put them all back. There are some adjustment shims here, so we'll have to pay attention. But this goes on this way. So the chamfer goes in. And I'm just referring to the Dempsey book. It's got great pictures. This side has 3 shims. So we'll put the 3 shims on. There's the Woodruff key, which we'll try not to drop into the engine. That's one of the reasons why I have those paper towels in there. If you're nervous about this, you can turn the engine so it's impossible for it to fall in, which I might end up doing because my hands are slippery and I got this in my other hand. And then this is the pin for adjusting the position of the sprocket. So, and then the sprocket itself goes this way. So let me turn the engine, make sure I don't drop anything, and I'll be right back. Another reason for tipping the engine is so the chain doesn't fall off its sprocket inside. So now I can put flat side facing out and just get this anywhere on there is fine for now. Make sure the threads are sticking out. So that's exactly the way it was before, and we'll adjust where this pin goes when we do the cam timing. But for right now, we're just trying to put the parts back. These chain ramps are plastic, so now is a good time to change those. These just pop out, I think. Ugh. I might need a pry tool to pop that out. There's a little bit of wear on this. Looks like a little rough right there, but other than that, it looks pretty nice. So here is the new one, and it is identical in just about every way that I can tell. I did decide not to change any of the sprockets because my feeling is that they should be changed as a set. And because I can't get to the sprocket way in the middle, it doesn't make sense to change the sprocket without changing the whole chain system. So I'm only going to change the ramps. But before I clip that on there, I'm going to try to get these lower ones out. So this special bolt is what holds the inner ramps in. So, and also it has a aluminum washer on there to seal it. Now when you remove this one, you want to be really careful that you don't let that just fall down in the engine. And then we'll note the direction on this one. This time the long portion is pointed towards the crankshaft. A little bit of wear right there. Now this chain ramp is slightly different than the rest. It's hard to see, but let me show you. The color is a little different. This one has a different height to it. So the distance from the hole to the ramp is different between the two. Okay, I'm using new sealing washers out of the kit, and we'll go ahead and put this ramp back in. Long side goes towards the crankshaft. I'm kind of working upside down here temporarily until we get this started. And I want to make sure that the bolt hole is going through the actual ramp, which right there, it's lined up perfectly. Just because the bolts are in doesn't mean that the ramp is in the right position. It can snap over the ends of the bolts. So this one I just snapped in with my pry tool. So I'm just reaching in there and about in the center, and I'm pushing it over so it snaps in. This lower one down there has not snapped in yet. So I'm using this pry tool and I'm shifting it over. So the bottom ramp should be at the same level as the top ramp. So this one's all the way in, can't go anymore. This one needs to come all the way over towards me. So now they're all snapped in their correct positions. Now the chain is just dangling from this upper gear, but it's centered in the groove of the ramps. So I can verify that on both the top and the bottom. These are 18.4. So let me come over here. I have looked down here and I can see that the intermediate shaft gear looks to be in great condition, and the sprocket down there is good with no extra pieces in there. The other thing we can do at this stage, now that the chain is still very loose, we can make sure that the camshaft is still turning. Even though this is finger tight, there's no binding in the camshaft. It will no longer slide in and out. Now it's okay to go ahead and put some torque on that bolt. So that is just the play of the pin. And then this is what the camshaft actually turns. So that just puts a little bit of tension here on the chain. So when we turn it, it's not going to skip a tooth or anything. Okay, I just finished catching the 1, 2, 3 side up with the 4, 5, 6 side. So I've got the gasket, the O-ring, all the sprockets, and the timing pieces on the camshaft. I got the chain ramps installed and the tensioner just mechanically holding everything together. Now this side, for some reason, was a little bit more difficult. So first thing that happened, when I removed the chain ramp from inside here, it broke. There is the little retaining pieces. So these are the pieces that came out. And they are the snap that clamps over the top of that special bolt. So no big deal. Luckily I had the engine turned, so when it broke, I heard it snap, and the pieces just fell out of the chain box here. And then when I went to put the new chain ramps back in, it was also difficult because I wasn't able to snap the lower one in. On the 4, 5, 6 side, I was able to pry with my tool and bring it towards me and snap it in. On this side, there's not as much purchase to pry against, or my tool just, for whatever reason, couldn't put the pressure on it to snap it over the bolts. So I ended up making a special tool, like I always do. This is just a metal piece of angle iron, and then I had to weld this tab on top so it has something to push against. So the internal part of the case, it's got a big window behind these 2 bolts. So this upright, actually the chain ramp goes underneath here, but the upright basically prevents it from moving back. So when you tighten these bolts, it automatically snaps the chain ramp in, and then you have to kind of wiggle it out. It's a little hard to wiggle out, but that's what I did to get the chain ramps installed, and they are perfectly lined up. Now I'm ready to go ahead and turn the engine. We can turn it now that the timing chains are connected and the cams are connected. So I'm gonna do a little bit of oiling so we don't run it too dry. You can put some oil here in the idle gear, and then I'll put some oil in the cam towers just to keep the camshafts lubed up while I turn it. So at this point we can take off the no turn warning. I've been turning the engine just a little bit, but you gotta be mindful of the chains. And there's no spark plugs, anything like that, so the engine should turn very freely. And there shouldn't be any tight spots either. That's enough. So the next big thing to do is to look at the positions of the sprockets and make sure that after all the top end was reassembled, that the sprockets are in alignment with the sprocket here in the center. So to do that, we need to take this little inspection cover off. Hey, does it look like there's a washer missing right here? It seems to me there's a big washer missing on the crankshaft pulley. So there's an O-ring behind that one. There's a specification for this surface right here, which is the shaft at which the inner sprocket is on. From here to here needs to be a specific number. That just makes sure that the chain is running true. It's not running non-parallel. And then same for this side. So we'll go off, I think it's this part of the gear to here. And those numbers are in the Bentley manual, so we just need to set up a straight edge. Before we can measure the heights on this, we gotta make sure these bolts are torqued. So this tool is a special Porsche tool. It just fits inside the sprocket. There's that side. There's a couple, bushings and tape and stuff to prevent this from getting all crooked in the tool. But in general, this thing works really well. Engine still turns fine. So to do this measurement, I'm gonna kind of push all these rotating parts in because there is some float in the camshaft. So I'm pushing them all the way in so we get an accurate measurement. And then I'm just measuring the depth of the intermediate shaft to the case. And then this is my straight edge that I'm using, and I've just screwed or bolted a machinist parallel to it. So that allows me to make sure that my gauge is perpendicular. And then I put this coupling nut on here and a bolt, so it just kind of helps me, steady the rest. So I'm gonna put pressure right here over the intermediate shaft, and I'm gonna come across here and take a measurement right there to the pulley or the sprocket. So I've zeroed my gauge to be 45.66 offset. So now when I put this on here, I don't have to do math every single time. So this gauge now reads pretty much 0 when I use it this way. Just touch and I get 43.63. So the target on this is 43.27 and I'm getting like 43.7. So this could use at least one shim, maybe two. So we gotta take this apart again, untorque this, and I gotta take that Woodruff key out. Oh, there it goes. I almost dropped that into there, which would be bad, but luckily it stopped right there. So we'll just keep the engine turned so nothing really wants to fall in there. That's a 0.25 millimeter guy there. And I'm gonna leave the Woodruff key out just because I may need to do this again. Plus, we're gonna have to untorque this when we do the timing anyways. .32. So we'll check on this side. Slide this down a little bit. .43. Flipped my plate over to the other side, and I now have this little bolt sticking out, so it kind of supports the weight of the straight edge. This thing's kind of heavy. 98.52. So this one is too far in as well. I'm beginning to think that the gaskets I used were a little bit thinner than the previous ones. Leave the Woodruff key out this time. .22. It's much better. Now I don't have a new gasket for this, so if this leaks, I will be replacing that in the car. It doesn't seem to compress very tight, so I will make a note that this is a potential item to order. Now on to the next step, it's cam timing. So I like to do it in two phases. I'm gonna do the coarse cam timing, which is basically just lining up the marks on the pulley, the distributor, and there's marks on the cams. We're gonna make sure everything is pointed straight up. So there's these little 930 markers. We wanna make sure they're pointed straight up. We wanna make sure that this is pointing straight to the notch on cylinder number 1, firing number 1. And we wanna make sure it's at top dead center for number 1. This is an interference engine, so if you don't get it close and you go to spin the engine, you could have a valve contact a piston, which would be bad, even if you're just turning it with a wrench. Underneath the dust cap is a very small, faint line right there. That is number 1. And here's the mark on the cam. It says 930. So the engine's at a little bit of an angle here, but that is not horizontal. It's basically turned to the left a little bit. And then this one here is actually upside down because there's been no regard to the positioning of that. So we'll correct it right now. We'll get it close, we'll level the engine, and we'll just eyeball those 930 marks to be pointing straight up. Here's the Woodruff key. It's very important. This goes in here. So just by eye, and like I said, this is a coarse adjustment, that's got it right on. I put the Woodruff key in this side, and its 930 is pointing straight up. That also means the Woodruff key is pointing straight up at 12 o'clock. So this is close enough, and the engine probably would run like this without damaging itself. So this is a big step in the right direction. Remember, we got the 930s pointing up, we got this at top dead center, Z1, and then we have the distributor rotor pointing to the notch in the distributor, which is for number 1. So now that the camshaft is roughly timed with the rest of the engine, we can put the rocker arms in, which is going to connect the camshaft to the actual valve opening and closing. Up until now, when I've been turning the engine, the valves are not opening or closing because there's no rocker arms. So let's put those in now, starting with number 4. And because I'm using the stock cam again, I need to make sure that I put the rocker arms back exactly where they came from on the cam position. So these are all labeled. This is number 4 intake. I don't know why. Porsche left out some little O-rings that go in these grooves. Seems like a wise idea to put them in there. I think the difficulty, and we're about to find out, is I think it makes assembly a lot more challenging. So let's see. Prior to putting the cam tower on, I did chamfer the leading edge of the cam tower to help get those seals installed just a little bit easier. So here they are, and they're nothing but just like a flat O-ring. I think we just stretch them over. Now, as luck would have it, I have this rocker arm that's broken. It's from another engine that I got in a bunch of parts. It was a complete engine, ended up parting this engine out. But I thought it was funny to keep this, and now it's coming into play because I'm going to use it as a ring compressor. This is going to squish the rubber O-rings down prior to installing it. So what I've done is I've opened up one side of the bushing with my die grinder, and I basically created a very generous cone so that when I go to put this on, basically it's a tight fit, but the O-ring will slip right on. And then once it gets to this side, this is a much sharper edge. Hopefully it'll just go straight into the bore and then into the real rocker arm. So that's my idea. Let's see how it works. I'm going to get something to push with that way. Just use this long extension. And so basically, I just line it up and push it through. And just have to feel a little bit. There we go. So now this part has already gone into this part of the cam tower. So now I should just be able to push it all the way through. Now we have one seal left, and it's in. We'll center that up a little bit and we'll go get the hardware. But I think I'm going to do that for all of them because it's pretty easy. And I'm gonna go ahead and get the wrench and just snug them up a little bit. We'll go ahead and torque all of them together, but we'll also make sure these are in the right location because I thought they were sort of installed incorrectly last time. Okay, last time I figured out you need to have a little bit standing proud so you can get it started easily. Found a little faster way to put these rings on. If you push with one fingernail and you just go around with your fingernails basically. I know my nails are dirty, but voila. All 6 rockers are on the 4, 5, and 6 side. This is the only tragedy. There's just a little bit of the O-ring. It's not even a full section of it, but a little bit of it got sheared off. The exhaust was a little bit harder since my tool can't butt right up against the surface there. Basically, you need to have a real thin tube in order for that method to work. But the chamfers that I put in the cam tower, that did seem to work. Everything's assembled now. I'm just going to do a quick valve adjustment, and then we'll do a very careful valve adjustment here on the intakes because that's important to set the cam timing. I have this little plate set up so my dial indicator, I have a magnetic dial indicator, it can mount onto here. And we're going to look at the valve lash of this adjuster right here. So right now the valve lash is massive, so it's falling off the adjuster. So I'm going to go ahead and tighten it up. Right now the engine is set up to fire number 1. This is cylinder number 1. Remember we had the rotor pointing to number 1 on the distributor body, and we also have it set to top dead center on Z1 on the crank pulley. So that is ready to set both the intake and exhaust valves for number 1. This gauge is in inches, so the target is 4/1000ths of an inch. So I'm just going to adjust it to 0. When it's down, and then you just rock this up and down, and that's the adjustment. That's the valve lash. So hopefully you guys can see this as I move the gauge or move the rocker. So that's 5, that's 0. The other way is to, put a feeler gauge down inside that hole. It's kind of a right angle. There's a lot of errors when you use the feeler gauge down low like that. So I much prefer this dial indicator method because it's really important for the cam timing. So to adjust 1/1000th of an inch out, it's a pretty minor adjustment. So we're gonna turn this just a few degrees. 0, 4. And then for now, I'm just gonna adjust the rest by feel. So I'm gonna go through the firing order now and adjust all the valves like close, just by feel. But I'll spend extra time like I did on number 1 intake and number 4 intake, because that's what controls the cam timing. We can go back and adjust the rest of the valves later. So the next cylinder to fire is gonna be 6. There's a next notch on the pulley, that's 120 degrees. And that's going to be cylinder number 6. Same for the exhaust. And then we'll turn the engine again to 2. I'm back at top dead center now, but notice that the distributor is pointing to a different place. Even though the pulley's in the same place, now the distributor is pointing to number 4. And that's because the distributor rotates at half the speed of the pulley. That'll be important when we do cam timing too. So if I was to guess just by listening to how this sounds, I'm gonna say it's 5, just so I get my feel kind of calibrated. But let's go put this on here. Right there on the adjuster. And I'll have to move the camera because it's not pointing towards you, but my guess of 5 was wrong. So that's 3. A 1/1000th adjustment is barely turning it like that much. One, 6, 2, 4, 3, 5. So now they are all within, a few thousandths of the desired adjustment. 1 and 4 intakes are perfectly set to 1 to 4/1000ths. I think it was part 2 where I showed this block. This basically just holds my dial indicator, and I can adjust it such that the pointer goes directly on top of the valve retainer. Now it's way down in the hole down there, so you'll have to take my word for it. I'll try to get a good picture of it. But I need to visually see that this is pointing directly on the valve retainer. I want to make sure there's a fair amount of torque on the pulley here, or on the sprocket. And I'm also going to put some tension on the chains. So when the car is running, there's a lot more tension than this. This is super floppy. So that's what these mechanical tensioners are for. We can mechanically tighten it without oil pressure. So that's key for doing the cam timing. You can't just have the chain loose and expect it to be in the correct position. So we don't want to put too much force where we bend this stud, but we do want to start to really feel a lot of tension in the chain. So it'll take a fair amount. I'm going to go ahead and tighten this side while I'm here too, because my feeling is that there's a bunch of pressure on the chain and it's pulling the intermediate shaft this way. So that could affect the rotation too. I think it's best to kind of keep it balanced as much as possible. So I'm going to dial in the same amount of tension on this side. We're going to need to do this next anyways. So now we can look at when number 1 intake valve opens. So I currently have the engine at number 1 top dead center with the rotor pointing to number 1. However, that is not the most interesting spot on the cam to do cam timing. You don't want it there because the cam is actually not active. It's on the base circle. So the question becomes, where do we position the crankshaft to do the cam timing correctly? And if you look at several different books, sometimes they they differ a bit in how to do it. And there's multiple ways to do it. And in my opinion, it's not that tricky. So you got to remember that there's 4 strokes in a 4-stroke engine. It's the, the suck, squeeze, bang, blow. Only 2 of those have the piston at top dead center. Right now I have it, the engine is situated at top dead center number 1. That is the bang part of the 4 strokes. That's when both valves are closed, which isn't that interesting for the cam. So we can rule that one out. The only other position that the piston is at top dead center is going to be between the suck and the blow. I mean, I'm sure I'll get comments on this, but that is the interesting part when the intake valve is just opening. The place that we want to be is the other top dead center. So right now the rotor is pointing to number 1. We want it to go all the way around to point to number 4. But before I do that, I want to zero my dial indicator because I know that 0 is on the base circle. So if I hit 0 now and tighten its little nut here, I will watch those numbers start to increase as I get closer to that cycle of the suck cycle. So watch the rotor going around. Right now, other cylinders are active, but we're getting closer to number 4 right now. So here is the Z1, and I'm just starting to get a number now on the dial indicator. So see, it's starting to ramp up. That's 0.09 millimeters. So when this lines up to the crack in the crankcase, that's how Porsche wants you to do the cam timing. When this is lined up, this needs to be 1.25. That's the way they do it. There's other ways to do it with degree wheels and so forth, but because these are the stock cams, we're going to use the Porsche method, which is basically you zero the pulley and you just measure a lift. The other way to do it is you specify a lift, it's usually 50 thousandths, and then you read the angle on the pulley. That's a good way to go too, especially for aftermarket cams. So if you look straight on here, this notch in the pulley is lined up right here with the crack in the case. So this case goes all the way along the split. So here is the line in the case. And then we just read the number up here, and I get 0.61, which is too low. It's supposed to be 1.25. Actually, anywhere between 1.1 and 1.4. It's not that far off just from eyeballing the 930 mark. All I did was eyeball it and make sure it was kind of horizontal. So I got it pretty close. Like I said, the engine would run like this, but it's not optimal. So we want to now take this bolt off. We're going to reposition this pin so that we get a little bit more lift on the cam. So we're going to advance the cam until it reads 1.25 or 1.3, something like that. Now, I don't want to move the engine, so I'm going to try to use these wrenches so nothing turns. I don't want to lose my reference. I just want to take the bolt out. I'm going to go ahead and pull this pin out because that's what preserves the cam timing. That pops right out. Now, if I can turn the cam, that's great. I may not be able to turn it. We'll see. I'm going to see if this moved. It did not. So now I just have some little, hardened pins. And I'm just going to kind of wedge this in there and see if I can move it. Sometimes I can, sometimes I can't. There's a lot of pressure on the camshaft now because all those valve springs are acting on it. So if I can move it, great. If not, we'll move it another way. 1.08, 1.25, and I'm going to go just a tad more. I know that when the chain stretches, this number gets lower. So I like to do 1.3. So if I can get this pin in there, we can lock that number in, and it's going to be one of these 3 holes. I think it's this one. Nope. Maybe it's this one. It's going to be one of those two. It's like right in between. Yeah, real light. It didn't move the camshaft, and it hasn't moved the crankshaft either. I'm looking right here. So let's put the bolt in and tighten it up and see what happens when it ramps itself up to Z1. We'll make sure we can repeat the 1.3. That's the full torque. I'm going to back the engine up a little bit. Doesn't hurt the engine. I'm back all the way down to 0. So we keep going until we get to 0. Actually, it's off by 0.01. So there's been some drift in the gauge or something, but that's close. 0.01, essentially 0. Getting close to Z1 and pointing to number 4. That's called valve overlap, where the exhaust valve is closing and the intake valve is opening, getting ready for that suck stroke. So now I'm at 0.06. And I'm going to try to eyeball this right to the mark. So I get 1.37. That's within spec. And like I said, I wanted 1.3, but once I put torque on the bolt, it somehow crept up to 1.37. I'll go ahead and do the other side, and we'll come back to this and see if it even changed. I'm just moving that same block over to this side. It works on both. Yep, I'm happy with that. So I'm going to lock the gauge down. So when we're thinking about setting up the timing for this bank 4, 5, 6, we have the same situation. Number 4 has 2 places that we want to know. It's either going to be at top dead center on the compression stroke, or it's going to be top dead center on the intake stroke. We want it to be in the suck cycle, and that's when the intake valve just opens. So right now we left off with this at number 4, top dead center. That's the compression stroke. That's not what we want. But we do want to zero the gauge when the valves are completely open. I'm sorry, when the valves are completely closed, we want to zero the gauge. I'm going to go a full 360 degrees. This should be pointing at number 1. So here we come. That's Z1. Now, piston number 4 is at the top, but it's no longer on the compression stroke. It's at valve overlap, or the squeeze stroke, intake stroke. So I will use my gauge again to verify we're at Z1. Looking straight on here. All right, so this one is 2.15. So my eyeball was, wrong on both sides. This side, it's off by like a millimeter. It should be, the other one was off by about 0.6 of a millimeter. This one's off by about a millimeter. So same procedure, we gotta take this bolt out so we can get to that pin and move it around. .30, 1.23. Let me go the other way. This time I'm going to go to 1.25 and hope that when I tighten it, it goes to 1.3. Get it back to 0. This side went all the way back to 0. And I'm going to leave the camera right here while I turn the engine, and we'll see if we've got 1.25 or what. Should be getting close. Let me check with my square. I mean, that might be a little bit closer. What do we get? Yeah, 1.19. So it's an iterative process. We just got to go back and update it. I'm going to advance it to 1.3 and see if it'll hold. Or maybe it'll go a little over 1.3 and see if we can get what we need. Let's try 1.3. Now the pin just went in the hole that was adjacent to the previous one. So you got very fine adjustment with this system that Porsche has developed. Let's see what we get now. 1.28. So I'm going to leave that one where it is, and I will go back and check the other side and probably move it one hole over. That should match it at 1.28. We'll try to make both sides agree. Got to swap out these mechanical tensioners for the hydraulic ones. That's not that bad. I'll show that next time, and then we should be able to start putting all the accessories on. But I'm so happy the engine is finally, I think, fixed. Hopefully we'll be driving in like maybe 2 more parts, maybe 3 more parts. I'm not exactly sure. I do have some nice goodies that have been refurbished that will go on the engine and make it look new again. So I'm excited about it. Thank you guys for being here. Cheers.